should actually all support them. But before actually I do that, I'm going to start with a question. Do you guys actually know when was the first clinical trial in Erdheim-Chester disease published? And I'm going to take the guess from the audience. I mean, does anybody have a guess when we published the first clinical trial in Erdheim-Chester disease? Therapeutic. And I think you will be probably surprised. It was actually electronically in June of 2015. And in paper form, that article actually was published just about a month ago. So, I mean, we are talking about importance of clinical trials, but we have done actually so far very little. And the first clinical trial published in ECD was just published a couple of weeks or a couple of months ago, and it was a study which was performed in Italy. So the first question is actually why do we even need to do clinical trials? And I think the clinical trials do answer two important questions which we need to know. And the first question is actually, does the treatment work? And the second question, equally important, is actually the new treatment safe? And these are two main reasons why we do clinical trials and why this type of work needs to be carried out in a systematic way, which has certain rules and which has actually certain parameters which need to be met. We actually answer these two questions. So the clinical trials are done in certain way, and there is a certain kind of a paradigm how clinical trials are carried out, and we do them in so-called phases. So when you have a new medicines which is tested in the lab and all the due diligence in the laboratory setting is done, all the safety data in laboratory animals are produced, then the drug actually moves to clinic. And the first step is called phase 1. And in that phase 1, you essentially try, your main endpoint is to actually define the dose and define the safe dose, and define the possible side effects. I mean, obviously, doctors and patients are also interested about the efficacy, and I mean, that's why we do that, and that's why patients are interested in participating. But from the scientific standpoint, the main goal of the phase 1 is actually to determine safety and main side effects. So the nature of the phase 1 studies is that you initiate a study using the doses which are deemed to be, based on laboratory experience, safe. And once you actually prove in first group of patients that these doses are safe, you can actually gradually move up to higher doses in the next group of patients until you kind of reach some kind of equilibrium between the maximum dose which you can achieve and the reasonable side effect profile. Once you actually complete that, once you did the due diligence and you know what your dose is, I mean, then you move to the next step. And that actually answers the question, does the treatment work? And so and that's called phase 2. And in phase 2, you essentially try the new medication or new approach in certain defined population of patients with certain diseases or cancers, such as whatever cancer you can think, or Erdheim-Chester disease. And actually, in that setting, you should actually identify whether there is like a signal of activity which would be worth of pursue, and which perhaps might lead to approval by regulatory agencies and approval as a standard of care. And then it's actually followed by the last step, which is called phase 3. And in that phase 3, you essentially compare your new therapeutic approach or your new medicine to the best existing option, which, I mean, can be whatever is a standard of care for a given condition, or if there is no available therapy, then you would use placebo in that setting. And even though it looks like that you have to go through those 3 relatively straightforward steps which are well defined, the process is everything but straightforward, and it can be actually lengthy and frustrating, and can often actually take up to 10 to 15 years. We had some examples, and vemurafenib would be one of them, when actually the development of the drug was significantly streamlined because we were capable of identifying patients who benefit from therapy based on the genetic studies of the tumor, but often the process actually can take quite significant amount of time. So going back to these phases, what's actually relevant to Erdheim-Chester disease, I mean, it's a quite rare disorder. I think it's more frequent than we think. I think the true incidence in the population is, as Dr. Diamond said yesterday at our medical symposium, is not known. And I would agree with that, because I think often this condition is probably underdiagnosed, especially in patients who have less significant clinical symptoms. But even taking into the account that true incidence would be higher than what we think, the patient population is relatively small, and that brings up certain specifics. So I think we can certainly put patients with Erdheim-Chester disease on phase 1 clinical trials. Phase 1 clinical trials are often not restricted to one cancer type or one disease type, and can be open to multiple tumor types, which can include Erdheim-Chester disease. And there's definitely a paradigm shift that more and more trials with increasing knowledge about the genomic background of Erdheim-Chester disease actually do allow enrollment of patients with ECD, even though they are not ECD-specific trials. And then the phase 2 trials can be again defined on certain genotype, let's say BRAF mutant tumors, which would include ECD, or you can do actually studies which would be specifically for ECD. I think at the moment, and probably not anytime soon, it would be realistic to actually do phase 3 trials. First of all, phase 3 trials can be relatively large and may actually enroll at least a couple dozens, if not a couple hundreds of patients, and that's obviously impossible to do in the ECD setting. The second thing is we don't really still have actually even well-defined standards. So I mean, what would be really the comparator arm in that setting, and I don't think it's actually it would be acceptable for most of you to be potentially randomized to placebo. So what are the advantages of clinical trials? I mean, so I would actually divide it into two groups: advantages from the global perspective, for the humanity, for the mankind, and the advantages for you as an individual patient. So from the global perspective, the clinical trials undoubtedly increase our knowledge about a particular disease and the way how that disease can be treated. They help us also to develop new therapies, and they also help us to prove efficacy of the new therapies, or on the other hand, the lack of thereof, because there have been instances, sometimes we feel that something actually works, and we may be doing that, but actually ultimately we might be proven wrong. And that has actually happened in some history of cancers as well. I mean, if we go back to breast cancer, about 20 years ago, there have been a boom of doing a high-dose chemotherapy with bone marrow transplant, which was perceived to be an effective option for patients with advanced breast cancer. And then ultimately, a couple of years down the line, actually the large clinical trials confirmed that that option is pretty much actually much less effective than we thought, and pretty much useless in that setting. And also, the clinical trials actually help us to identify side effects, because you have to follow the protocol, you have to document things in very rigorous way, which actually helps you to identify side effects, and not only to identify them, but also to communicate them with the community. The advantages for you as an individual who struggles with this disease, I mean, one of the major selling points would be that it can actually give you the access to new therapies, which either may not be commercially available, and if they are commercially available, they might have restrictions in terms of reimbursement and access. So it's an expansion of therapeutic options. I mean, despite all the success which we have with Erdheim-Chester disease lately, especially in patients with BRAF mutations, I mean, so far we don't really have, and even though the patients on BRAF inhibitors so far don't seem to have disease relapse of the disease while on BRAF inhibitors, but still we don't really have an option which would be like a cure for Erdheim-Chester disease patients. So I mean, you look at the condition as a kind of a chronic disease for which you have to use your therapeutic armamentarium wisely. So you want to have the maximum therapeutic options, that if you get to the point that the therapy which you are currently on can be no longer used, either because it doesn't work or because it has a side effects which are too bothersome, then you would like to have actually another option which you can use. And that, so actually having an access to clinical trials just simply by the nature of that expands your therapeutic options. And also, which might be a bit more controversial, I don't think we have a data for ECD given the limited experience with clinical trials, but there are actually data from cancer patients suggesting that patients treated on clinical trials may actually have better outcomes compared to patients who are treated outside of clinical trials. And there might be many confounding factors behind that. The patients who go on clinical trials might be just simply in better shape to start with. So, it's another piece of evidence which provides reassuring that you are probably not losing out on trying experimental therapies. So what are the disadvantages? I mean, for mankind, I actually don't really see any. I mean, it's, I think you always, even if the trial is negative, it always expands your knowledge, and it always moves you forward. So as long as the trial is scientifically and ethically well designed, which should be pretty much guaranteed, because we have a regulatory processes in place which should make sure that the scientific question is valid, and then all the ethical requirements are met. For individual patients, there are some disadvantages, though. I mean, the clinical trials can be frustratingly suffering from lack of flexibility. So, I mean, in order to get on the clinical trials, you have to actually tick all the boxes. You have to meet all the inclusion criteria. You may not have anything, you should not meet any single exclusion criteria. And that actually can be incredibly frustrating for patients and physicians, because these criteria are often set arbitrarily, and they may not necessarily have medical significance in each individual patient. So sometimes you may not qualify for a clinical trial because of not meeting some criteria which actually have sort of debatable medical significance. Often the clinical trials require much more time investment. I mean, the clinical trials need to be only done in a place which is approved by the regulatory agencies, including the local institution review board. So essentially the medication most often cannot really be given anything else or anywhere else, or the clinic visit needs to happen in that institution which is approved for that given clinical trial. And given the fact that, I mean, all of us have patients which are from all around the United States, or even I would say from all around the world, that makes clinical trials quite cumbersome, especially if the clinical trials require a more intense visit, which sometimes can be once a week, once every 2 weeks, once every 4 weeks. And that obviously leads to financial constraints, time commitments. And there is obviously always a risk of possible unknown or unexpected side effects, especially with new medications, even though each new medication requires quite intense laboratory workup before it moves to the clinic. I mean, still, if there is a side effect which is rare, which happens in with 1% or less frequency, that's something which may not be exactly prepared for, since we may statistically not have seen it yet. So why should you consider clinical trials? I mean, I think I kind of made a good argument to support that there are good reasons to do that. I mean, it's important for developing new therapies. But also there is another element to that. I think we all struggle, patients and physicians, sometimes with the payers and with getting the therapies to the patient. I mean, one good example would be anakinra, which essentially I think everybody in this room would probably agree that anakinra is a useful treatment for some patients with Erdheim-Chester disease, but we have actually never really produced an evidence from a clinical trial. And often when you actually go to payers, the payers actually ask you for that type of evidence. So I mean, it's actually incredibly important that we generate the data, and we generate the data in a way that we can go back to payers and say, this is actually the study which shows that this makes sense for this group of patients, and that actually makes the reimbursement process remarkably more simple. So that's why we are kind of really hungry and trying to cooperate how we can get the data from how we can actually analyze the data and combine the data using all the data which we have combined. So I think, and the clinical trials, or the testing in the clinical trials, is really kind of a necessary tool to make the progress happen. So I think ECD has its own specifics which need to be taken into account when you think about it in the context of clinical trials. And I think these specifics need to be taken into account when we think about clinical trials as a community, and what clinical trials we should design and what clinical trials we should be carrying out. So I think probably everybody in this room would agree that over the last couple of years, the prognosis and outcomes of patients with ECD have dramatically improved. But I think there is still a lot of improvement. There is still a lot of room for improvement. But in order to meet this expectation of improvement in the years to come, we have to take into account a couple specific points. I mean, we still have relatively limited therapeutic armamentarium, plus we have limited resources in terms of number of patients which we have and in terms of number of financial means which we can allocate to our clinical trials. So we have to think about really carefully about which question from the large number of questions which we would like to have an answer to, we would like to prioritize. So I mean, one of the strategies which I see as a kind of a viable strategy is that us as a medical professionals or ECD as an alliance and patient advocacy group, we need to advocate that the patients with ECD have access to phase 1 studies which are designed for cancer patients. The landscape is changing, and the landscape is changing quite a bit. And I'm going to share with you some examples of clinical trials which are open to ECD patients in addition to cancer patients, which these studies were initially designed for. But I think that's one of the one of the things which would give an access to for ECD patients to new medicines in order to potentially identify the signal of activity which can then be further pursued, perhaps specifically in the ECD patients. So that would be for phase 1. For phase 2, what we have, what we made like a really great experience with is something which is called basket approach. Since a lot of new medicines which are being developed now are medicines which work for only for patients with some specific genetic changes in the cancer. BRAF is a typical example that patients with BRAF mutations with ECD or even many other cancer types do respond to BRAF inhibitors, and that actually kind of created the concept of the basket trial, when you allow patients, regardless of the underlying tumor, to enter the study and get the medicine, providing they have underlying molecular abnormalities such as BRAF. So it doesn't really matter which tumor you have, whether it's ECD, Langerhans, lung cancer, or thyroid cancer, but you can go on a study providing you have BRAF mutation. And that can actually help you to identify in which population of patients you can see the activity, because unfortunately the activity is not guaranteed across the board just because you have BRAF mutation. And again, it's kind of a viable strategy to include ECD patients in these basket efforts. And then finally, I mean, we can do dedicated ECD specific phase 2 studies, and I think we should do that, but I think we have to be very careful about which study we design, and it's something which we should agree as a community and limit our effort to probably very few efforts which can ultimately lead to a registration of a new medicine for ECD patients, and once you have registration, that also means that usually means reimbursement as well. So I think we should be very selective about which studies we run specifically in the ECD patients, and that should be studies in which we have a lot of reasons to believe that it will ultimately lead to the registration by FDA in the United States or European medicine agencies on the other side of the pond. I think phase 3 studies, in my view, are not really feasible at this point, and I think regulatory agencies, I think, are quite receptive to that. So, where you can learn about clinical trials or what clinical trials are available to you, I think ECD Global Alliance makes an effort to put clinical trials which are available to ECD patients on their website. I mean, it's kind of work in progress. I think we have to find a better way how to keep this information updated, because I think there are far more there are far more trials available now, since many of the phase 1 trials or basket trials actually do allow ECD patients, and even though these studies are not ECD specific. ClinicalTrials.gov is a website which essentially nearly any clinical trial should be registered for, irrespective of indication and irrespective of medication. It might be a little bit hard for patients to navigate through that. Plus, it doesn't exactly actually tell you which clinical trial is open, whether the spot is available right now, because even if the clinical trial is open, it doesn't necessarily mean that there is a spot available at that moment for that patient. So it's a good kind of a tool to give you a feel what's going on. It may not be as practical if you are looking specifically for something which you would like to do right now. And I think obviously the activity of care centers should also kind of centralize the knowledge about the clinical trials which are available, and should streamline the communication that you will find easier to get your head around. I mean, this is by no means the complete list of clinical studies which are available, and I think, again, I emphasize this is by no means complete list, but I just wanted actually to put some examples just to kind of like give you a feel that it's actually, there is quite a lot of going on, and that's a huge cultural change. And there are studies available. I think definitely for BRAF mutation, for patients with BRAF mutations, there is a lot of activities going on. I would highlight the study which is currently carried out at NIH, which combines dabrafenib, which is a BRAF inhibitor, with a drug which is called trametinib, which is MEK inhibitor. And the reason why we do combination, because this is kind of a unique situation, because actually the combination of dabrafenib and trametinib is actually less toxic than using the BRAF inhibitor dabrafenib alone. It's kind of a unique situation in treatment of tumors, because usually more drugs means more toxicity, but this one is actually opposite, because trametinib is capable of alleviating or abrogating some toxic effects which dabrafenib by itself might have. So that's a trial which is a specifically ECD trial, which I think needs to be supported by us as a physicians and by us as a community, because obviously the anticipation is that trial might ultimately lead to regulatory approvals which will make these therapies available to ECD patients. Obviously, there might be many reasons why some patients cannot make it to NIH for that. So, I mean, many centers have basket trials, such as My Pathway, which is supported by Genentech, which provides vemurafenib for BRAF mutant tumors, for most of the BRAF mutant tumors, with exception of BRAF mutant tumors for which we already have regulatory approval, or in which we know that vemurafenib is not effective. Dabrafenib trametinib is also another basket trial. Again, it's a kind of a same concept as the ECD study at NIH, which is also available. I think some new drugs such as ERK inhibitor BVD523, and there will be more ERK inhibitors coming on board, which also actually will consider enrolling, patients with Erdheim-Chester disease. What is attractive about these drugs, because they don't actually block BRAF only, but they block the whole pathway. So these options might be potentially attractive for patients also without BRAF mutations, which is a patient population in which we were a little bit lingering behind in terms of therapeutic and clinical trials options. PLX8394 would go to kind of the same space for BRAF, but also for non-BRAF disease. As you can see, in non-BRAF space, there is a much less going on, but also there are some also some new drugs which are coming on board, like CSF1R inhibitors. And the situation is definitely dramatically different to what it used to be just really a few years ago. So I think one of the take-home message, I would say, I mean, like people often say, I mean, why should I do clinical trials? I don't want to be guinea pig. I don't think nobody participating in clinical trial is a guinea pig, because guinea pig doesn't have a choice. I mean, you always have a choice. And at the end of the day, I mean, the standard of care which is associated with clinical trials is now actually something which payers need to pay for. So whatever standard of care you have associated with clinical trials, I mean, insurance providers or Medicare actually does pay for. So I mean, from the payer's perspective, the clinical trials are actually seen as a standard of care. So I think, in a way, the access to clinical trials and access to meaningful clinical trials can be actually viewed as a part of standard of care. So I think that's all what I meant to say, and I think I heard that this is supposed to be interactive, so I'm hoping to have some questions.